Okay, so get this, listeners. Someone wants to put a luge track, like an actual luge track on Kilvey Hill.
Yeah, a luge track in Swansea. Wild, isn't it?
Seriously. And you know we love a deep dive, so you guys sent us a mountain of, well, everything. Planning docs.
We've got objections from like every community group.
Even some videos.
Yeah.
And let me tell you, some folks are seriously fired up about this whole luge situation.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty classic example of that development versus environment kind of crash.
Oh, absolutely. And Kilvey Hill, come on, it's the perfect example of that fight.
Right. I mean, think about it. You've got this area used to be all industrial, right?
Yeah, now it's like this haven of peace, all woodland, right outside the city. I bet folks are going there to escape. Like,
People go for the walks, for the views. Did you see that sunset in one of those videos?
oh, stunning, absolutely gorgeous. But hidden in all these planning documents.
Tucked away in the fine print.
Yeah, our plans for like gondolas up the hill, luge tracks, zip lines. They even want to stick a rooftop bar up there.
And that's where things get really complicated. On one hand, you've got jobs, tourism, all that economic good stuff.
Right, sounds great on paper.
But then you start to look closer, and there's deforestation worries, noise pollution, even concerns about the wildlife being disturbed. It's a mess.
Yeah, and it goes beyond just the environment. These community responses, a lot of them are saying, hold on, Kilvey Hill belongs to all of us. You can't just fence it off. It's always been open.
There's a real sense of ownership there, a protectiveness about the hill that comes across so strongly in these documents. Like, people are talking about childhood memories, the peace it brings them now. It's clearly more than just a patch of land to a lot of people.
It's woven into the fabric of who they are.
Yeah, exactly. It's part of their story,
Absolutely. So then how do you balance those emotional connections, that sense of shared history with cold, hard economics?
It's tough. And that's where the Well-Being of Future Generations Act comes in. That 2015 legislation basically throws a wrench in the whole thing.
Okay, so for those of us who might not be experts in Welsh law,
Most of us.
right, can you give us the quick version? What's this act all about, and why is it such a big deal here?
So basically, it makes anyone making big decisions in Wales, like about development projects, think long-term. Not just what's the quick win, but like how will this affect the environment, the community, everything, like 50 years from now.
So they can't just go for the quick buck.
Exactly. It's about the big picture.
Yeah.
A prosperous Wales, a healthier Wales, a more equal Wales.
So they have to think about all of that when they're deciding whether to give this luge track the thumbs up.
Yeah, it's like this ethical checklist they have to tick off. And that's where things get really interesting, because will this project actually tick all the boxes? I mean, will it really bring prosperity without trashing the environment that makes Kilvey Hill so special? Will it benefit everyone in Swansea, or just a select few?
Those are the million-dollar questions. And from what we've seen so far, the answers seem to depend on who you ask.
Mhm.
So let's get into the nuts and bolts of this Skyline luge proposal. First off, what are they actually planning to build, and does it even come close to meeting these well-being goals?
Buckle up, because they're not thinking small. We're talking a gondola system running from Landor Park and ride all the way to the top.
Hold on, gondolas? Like in Venice?
You got it. Plus, multiple luge tracks winding down the hillside.
Wait, multiple? How many luge tracks does one hill need?
At least 2, according to their plans. Oh, and they've thrown in a zip line, a sky swing, mountain bike trails. The works.
Wow. They're really going for it. That can't be cheap. Or easy on the environment. What kind of impact are we talking about? One thing that jumps out from these reports is deforestation. They're worried about that.
Yeah, and it's not just cutting down trees. It's the habitats, the wildlife, the water systems. All of that could be affected. And you know what else? The noise.
The noise.
Apparently could get really loud, like over 75 decibels.
75! That's like a jackhammer, isn't it?
It's up there. Not exactly the peaceful nature retreat folks are used to.
No kidding. And one of these leaflets actually calls it a quiet area.
Speaking of peace and quiet, what about the impact on the community? Building a giant tourist attraction in what's basically a public park? Someone's not going to be happy about that.
That's an understatement. Just
Yeah.
the idea of restricting access, even if it's just a small area, people are seeing red. It's understandable, though. They feel like they're losing something that's theirs. Especially since Kilvey Hill obviously means a lot to people. You can tell from these letters, people reminiscing about walking there as kids, finding peace there when times were tough. It's more than a park. It's like a touchstone for them.
It really is. And that's something we need to keep in mind. This isn't just about spreadsheets and profit margins. It's about understanding what Kilvey Hill represents to the people who love it. That's got to factor into the equation somehow.
Definitely. Okay, so We've got our beloved community space, we've got ambitious, maybe even grandiose development plans, and we've got a whole lot of questions about how, or even if, those two things can coexist.
Got a lot to unpack.
It is. But before we get totally lost in environmental impact studies and financial projections, let's take a step back and think big picture for a minute. Because one thing that really struck me reading through all this was the disconnect. Ugh, huge disconnect.
Between the developer's vision and what the community's actually saying.
Oh, it's like they're speaking different languages, you know?
All right.
The developers are all about visitor numbers, return on investment, all that jazz. But the community is saying, hey, this is our backyard, our refuge. You can't just slap a price tag on that.
It's more than that.
Exactly.
It's, like you said, two different languages. The developers are speaking the language of profit margins and tourism revenue.
And the community speaking the language of memories, of shared history, of that connection to nature that's getting harder and harder to find these days, you know?
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole thing so complicated. Because it's not just about numbers, it's about values, right? And those values are often really hard to quantify. Like, how do you put a price tag on a child's memory of running through the woods, or a moment of peace and quiet in a world that feels increasingly chaotic?
You can't put a price on that. And yet, those are the things that are at stake here.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's really resonating with people. Because this isn't just about Kilvey Hill, it's about a much bigger issue. It's about whether we've become so fixated on economic growth that we've forgotten the value of things that can't be measured in pounds and pence.
And it's not just about the money either. There are real concerns about the environmental impact of this project. Deforestation, habitat loss, noise pollution, all of those factors have to be taken into consideration.
And those are legitimate concerns.
Yeah.
I mean, look, I'm all for economic development, but not at the expense of the environment. We have to find a way to strike a balance.
Well, and the developers would argue that they are trying to strike that balance. They talk a big game about sustainability, using recycled materials, minimizing their footprint, all that. But it's hard to see how a project of this scale can truly be environmentally friendly.
Right. And that's where the devil's in the details. It's one thing to say you're going to plant some trees to offset the ones you're cutting down. But what kind of trees are they planting? Where are they planting them? Are they native species that will actually benefit the local ecosystem? Or are they just going for the cheapest, fastest growing option that will tick a box on a checklist?
Okay, so it's not just about what they're doing, it's about how they're doing it. And that requires a certain level of transparency, a willingness to be held accountable for those decisions.
Exactly. And that's where the Well-Being of Future Generations Act comes into play. Because it's not just about setting these lofty goals, it's about having a mechanism in place to ensure that those goals are actually met.
So it's one thing for the developers to say, oh yeah, we're going to be super sustainable, but it's another thing entirely for them to be legally obligated to demonstrate how they're going to achieve that sustainability.
Right. And not just to demonstrate it, but to have those claims independently verified. Because otherwise, it's just greenwashing. It's empty promises that sound good on paper, but don't actually translate into real-world action.
And that's not good enough. Not anymore. Because the stakes are too high.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're not just talking about the future of Kilvey Hill here. We're talking about the future of our planet. And that's not something we can afford to get wrong.
Well said. So we've talked about the economic arguments, we've talked about the environmental concerns, but what about the social impact of this project? Because a lot of the community responses we've seen are focused on the potential loss of access to Kilvey Hill, a place that holds a lot of meaning for a lot of people.
Right. And that's a really important point because it gets at the heart of what makes Kilvey Hill so special. It's not just a piece of land, it's a place where people connect with nature, with each other, with their own history. And that kind of connection is invaluable. You can't put a price tag on it.
And yet it seems like that connection is often overlooked in these kinds of development projects.
It is. And I think that's a real shame because ultimately, people are what make a place special. A luge track might be fun for a day, but it's those shared experiences, those connections to place and community that create lasting memories.
So how do we ensure that those connections aren't lost in the pursuit of economic development?
That's the million-dollar question. And I don't think there's an easy answer. But I think it starts with recognizing the value of those connections, of those intangible benefits that are so often overlooked. And it means involving the community in the decision-making process from the very beginning, not just as an afterthought.
Because ultimately, this isn't just about building a luge track, it's about shaping the future of Swansea.
Exactly. And that future should be one that benefits everyone, not just a select few.
And that's where the Well-Being of Future Generations Act comes in. because it provides a framework for making decisions that prioritize the long-term well-being of both people and the planet.
It's about thinking beyond the next quarter's profits and considering the legacy we're leaving for future generations.
And that's a legacy worth fighting for. So we talk about the environment, the community, and this whole idea of progress versus like actually preserving something special. And then there's this well-being of future generations act hanging over everything. This feels big, like it could make or break the whole luge thing, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. This act, it's not just some vague suggestions,
Yeah.
It's literally the law, and it's meant to change how things get done in Wales. And those 7 well-being goals it talks about, I mean, they're like a dream list for a better future.
Okay, so remind me again, what are these goals and how do they apply to like a luge track on a hillside?
Right, so you've got things like a prosperous Wales, a resilient Wales, a healthier Wales, a more equal Wales, and we're still not done. There's a Wales of cohesive communities, vibrant culture, and global responsibility. It's about looking at the long game, understanding that what we do today, it echoes through generations.
It's like that saying, right? We don't inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. Except now, it's the law in Wales.
Exactly. So when Swansea Council looks at these luge track plans, they can't just focus on, oh, this will bring in some cash. They've got to show how this lines up with all those goals, the whole well-being shebang.
All right, so let's play devil's advocate here. The developers are saying this project means jobs, more tourism. That sounds like it checks the prosperous Wales box, doesn't it?
On the surface, maybe. But prosperity, it's not just about money, right? It's about an economy that works for everyone long-term, not just a quick buck for a few. And that's where this act gets really interesting. It forces you to ask the hard questions, like, will these be decent jobs that actually help people? Will the money from tourists actually benefit the community? Or will it just end up lining the pockets of some big developer who's out of here next year?
And what about those other goals? If this thing harms the environment, blocks access to a place people love, makes a ton of noise pollution, how does that fit with a healthier, more resilient Wales, let alone a more cohesive one?
Exactly. And that's the real test, isn't it? Because anyone can write down some nice-sounding goals, but actually putting them into action. That takes real scrutiny, a willingness to say, hold on, does this really make sense? And that kind of transparency, frankly, it's not always been there in these development deals.
So you're saying this act, it could be a game changer, but only if it's actually enforced, if people are held accountable for sticking to it.
100%.
Yeah.
And that's where the community's role is so important.
Yeah.
Because this act, it's not just about the government telling everyone what to do. It's about giving communities the power to shape their own future.
So it's not just ticking boxes on a form. It's about real conversations between the developers, the people making the decisions, and the people who actually live with the consequences of those decisions.
Exactly. And that's why all those community responses, the letters, the petitions, they matter. Because it's not just complaining, it's saying, we're watching and we're holding you to a higher standard. You said you cared about our well-being, so prove it.
Because if a project like this luge track, as fun as it sounds, can't show how it benefits everyone now and in the future, what's the point?
Exactly. And honestly, that's a powerful message, not just for Swansea, but for all of Wales. It's saying, we're not just thinking short-term here, we're building something better for everyone.
That's a great point to end on, I think. Thanks for guiding us through all this. It's been quite a journey. We started with a luge track, and somehow we ended up talking about the future of a nation.
Well, it just goes to say, sometimes the smallest things can spark the biggest conversations.
They really can. And for everyone listening, whether you're in Swansea or anywhere else, remember, you've got a voice. Read those plans, ask the tough questions, and don't let anyone tell you that your well-being doesn't matter. Because it does.
It absolutely does. The future is not something that just happens to us. It's something we build together.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder the possibilities. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.